Final Act tonight is with Alhassan Bello on the touch screen. We're talking about Russia and Ukraine war. We're coming to you with an update of the latest. Bello, good evening. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Are you feeling okay now?
Yeah,
you were in hospital last week.
Yeah.
Is it good?
Yeah, it's good now.
You're fine, eh?
Yeah.
Okay. So tell us, what's happening in the Ukraine war?
Well, the war is gradually becoming a stalemate because the initial Russian offensive has grounded to a halt. Initially, they were as far as the peripheries of Kiev, but now they've been forced to withdraw from Kiev, Chernihiv. Now the focus is now around the Donbass.
Didn't they start the Donetsk and Lushan at the beginning because that's nearer Russian territory?
You know, they crafted the whole thing to be a law and order operation, so special military operation without declaration of war from the Russian parliament in the first place. And the justification was that they wanted to denazify Ukraine and protect Donbass. Denazify Ukraine.
Nazi referring to Hitler, Nazi.
Hitler.
Okay.
But then there's an element of truth to a certain extent in that aspect, because if we go by democracy, every government must serve its term fully. Then the Western support for the Euromaidan revolution truncated the regime of Alexander Yanukovych, okay, in 2014. That was technically a coup d'etat. Okay. But then to say that the entire Ukrainian system is made up of far right is also too much of an extreme position, because there was this element of the Azov Brigade, which was entrenched in Mariupol, if you still recall, that are from extreme right-wing background. But that does not mean the entire Ukrainian system is totally far right. But then that was a justification that Russia used, that in order to secure the interests of the two Donetsk republics, that is the Luhansk Republic and then Donetsk Republic, which it recognized as independent state, it went as far as Kiev, which is more like a regime change. But having failed to achieve that purpose, now it's refocused back to its own initial effort. So now the epicenter of the war itself is now within the Donbass region. That's at the moment Severodonetsk, which is I think the largest city in Luhansk, is almost entirely captured. And then what they did now is that
But this is what, 3-4 months into the war?
Yeah.
And Russia are still at the peripheries of the border? That's not what they bargained for, is it?
Well, they realized that they've stretched their, offensive too far than their logistics can support. So what they are doing now is that they're trying to focus on the Donbass region in order to secure a foothold that link Donbass, that is Luhansk and Donetsk, with Mariupol, which they captured, down to Crimea, which they initially annexed in 2014. So by doing so, they have a land corridor that allowed them to ferry in more supply and more troops. So we are in for a very long war, and Russia is prepared for it. But what we don't understand is will the Western countries continue to have that will to back Ukraine with weapons? Okay,
so Kiev is now secured for the Ukrainian government.
Kiev and Kharkiv.
They are both for the Ukrainian government. It is in Donetsk and Luhansk that there's
a
battle.
Luhansk is being fought out. Kherson is still under, the Russian control. But then the Ukrainian forces are also gaining some ground within this region. But what we are seeing aside this one, there's always been this attempt to make Ukraine landlocked. And that is affecting the export of commodities. So we've seen Russia blockaded, Mariupol has been captured. So now Odessa, Mykolaiv, all these port cities are now being blockaded. So Ukraine cannot export its grains. That's why we're having the, rising cost of grains and other foodstuffs. And then another thing, so these are the entire, some of the Ukrainian agricultural exports across the world. So I think China imports about 8.9% of its grains from,
Yeah, but China will continue to, from Russia or from Ukraine?
From Ukraine.
Okay. So there's China, India, Egypt, Turkey are all getting from Ukraine. And so these supplies have been closed or they have been reduced? They have been closed.
So now these countries are dependent, the world is dependent on what we have. But nothing we are not seeing, the focus now on getting these things to be exported. Fine, they could be exported. But if the war should continue for a long time, will the farmers be able to go back to the field to even grow their crops?
Okay, so there's some in the something like a buffer stock that can be exported.
That can be exported. So
why is Russia not allowing that to go to the rest of the world?
Well, Russia's position is that in order for it to export, for those things to be allowed, it's trying to bargain with the West for some sanction relief.
Oh, I see. Okay, so Russia is holding the line for these exports to move out.
Ukraine, Russia is another leading producer of these commodities.
Of those commodities.
So, but Russia is under sanction. So it's affecting Russia's own exports.
So Russia cannot export its
own.
And so between Russia and Ukraine, they control a significant amount of grain and
wheat,
all of that, wheat and all those
things. So whilst Russia cannot export its own due to sanction,
Ukraine cannot export due to the war.
Russian blockade. So technically, they are both affected. So Russia is not trying to get sanctions.
I saw somebody make a post on Facebook, I think it was Yanisako, who said that could all of these sanctions on Russia have been a grand miscalculation? Maybe that's something that people should start looking at.
Well, I think there's this report by Bloomberg that, Biden is giving U.S. some exception to import fertilizer from Russia. And there was also this report that said Russia made over $9 billion within the first 3 months of its war in Ukraine.
From fertilizer?
No, from export of what you call it, crude oil.
Oh, I see. $1 billion.
Yeah, I think the sanction itself is miscalculated.
Well, some people hold that view.
They should show us a regime that has been crippled by sanction, that has been overthrown. From Iran to North Korea to Zimbabwe, they are still intact. Only the ordinary people are suffering.
That's an interesting analysis. That you're saying that regimes that have been sanctioned
have never
by the
failed.
West, the regime has not collapsed.
From Venezuela to North Korea,
Cuba,
to Iran, to Cuba, to Zimbabwe. The only people suffering are the ordinary citizens.
Even the Nigeria's Abacha's regime, it didn't collapse until Abacha
sanction
died.
itself is a lazy man approach. It's just a way of trying to paint some symbolic gesture.
And you're saying that when sanctions come, it's the ordinary people who suffer, not the regime.
And another thing we need to look at this place is that whilst the developed countries are not feeling the pinch so much, because of the economic hardship in the developing world, we are feeling the pinch. And also due to climate change, we can also not grow substantially to meet the shortfall.
Why are the developed countries not feeling it?
You know, agriculture over there is not dependent on rainfall. It is mechanized and full of irrigation. So to a certain extent, they also have huge stockpiles that they've been able to store.
Okay.
But we have less that we have saved, and we have less that we have, grown. And we only have capacity to produce very, very limited ones. So even if you are
because of our nature of agriculture, the non-mechanized.
So in the long run, it is affecting developing nations. Another important thing is that it is also affecting UN, operations. You know, UN and through UNHCR and the UNICEF buy these things to feed the refugees across the world. They are also feeling the pinch because even when UN has the funding, it can't access some of these things. But so far, this attempt by Turkey, Turkey through its own dealings with Russia, despite being a NATO member, has been able to build this kind of backdoor channel. So it's trying to negotiate with Russia to see if some of the blockade can be lifted on the Ukrainian port. Because from the onset, Russia made two decisions: to overthrow the Ukrainian government, one, and also make Ukraine a landlocked country by making sure it capture key, port cities. Another thing now is that, and these are the percentages that are imported across the world. Africa imports an entire of 13%, 13.3% of the grains and the rest from Ukraine. And then Middle East has 15.9%. And also, Middle East is also suffering a lot. Also, the desert nature of the place itself. So
they can't grow. The agriculture is weak.
Most countries in the Middle East are equally dependent on food import, naturally, because of the nature of their terrain. Now, they also don't have access.
Only Gaddafi was able to do it down.
If you look at countries like key US allies like Saudi Arabia and UAE, their position, rather than siding with the US in condemning Russia, they've taken a middle ground where they are calling for dialogue and negotiation to end the war. But they've not taken side because of their vulnerability when it comes to food and commodities and how it could spell political backlash and upheavals in the house. And then, so now between NATO and Russia, who has more to lose in this context is Russia. And who has more to lose, put everything in the war. So now, these two countries have always been neutral.
Sweden and Finland.
Yeah. But because of the alleged Russian aggression, these two countries have changed their position. They voted to join NATO, even though their membership is still being held hostage by Turkey for its own domestic reasons. But then now, having lost the neutrality of these two countries, it will compel Russia to demand more claim on the Ukraine itself. And I think two things must be understood very instantly. The Western countries miscalculated Russia's security concern and posture. And then I've always said it, and I always say it. Zelensky made a fool of himself. He overblown his importance to the world, and now he's suffering the pinch.
Well, that's your opinion.
But that's a fact.
Well, you can't call that a fact. It's your opinion.
But that's a fact.
You can share it and we can interrogate it, but that's your opinion.
We can look at the whole thing on the ground.
Yeah. Okay, go on.
Now, the outcomes of the war could be that war itself is politics. Soldiers don't create war. Politicians create war. Soldiers do the dying, then politicians resolve the war on the peace table. But how do we go to the negotiating table? Having lost the neutrality of Sweden and Ukraine, Russia will demand more territorial claims on Ukraine. And that means, aside the focus on Donbass now, which to me, and based on certain analysis, you could see that it is just born out of exigency of the current situation. If he's able to secure Donbass and the entirety of the build a land corridor from Crimea up to Luhansk, that will allow him to ferry in more troops and more weapons and push further into Ukraine.
Towards Kiev?
Not necessarily towards Kiev, because if he should go for all-out conquest, the backlash should be huge. But he would try to gain more around the, Russian-speaking zones of Ukraine. But what we can't really tell is that will they now be incorporated into Russia as Russian territories, or maybe at the negotiating table, they will end up having some form of autonomy than they enjoy today. But what is certain is that after this war, without Ukraine securing a total victory on the ground, Ukraine will never be the same politically. Because if Russia is able to impose peace, hegemonic peace, then the political structure of Ukraine will have to change to make certain demands. And then, another thing to understand, initially before the war, it was Russia's security that was at stake. With the boots on the ground, what is at stake now is Russia's global prestige. So until Putin...
So that's an ego matter.
Yeah. So until Putin is sure that the territorial gains of victory in Ukraine commiserate with regaining Russia's global prestige, I think we are in for a very long battle. And then finally, when you talk, they say you have been anti-Western or you have been pro-Russia. Now, the Pope also made a comment.
What did he say?
It was a long speech, but he ended up saying that it is not a black and white issue. We do not see the whole drama unfolding behind this war, which was perhaps somehow either provoked or not prevented. It goes back to the point that before Russia went into the war itself, it sought dialogue with NATO, and NATO rebuffed that approach. So can we absolve NATO from culpability?
Let's go on with the Pope.
And so he also said, so it was a long speech, he said, and then he asked himself, asking himself historically, he said, if that made him pro-Putin, he said, no, I'm not. It would be simplistic and wrong to say such a thing.
Is he criticizing the American approach to the war? He says, we do not see the whole drama unfolding behind this war, which was perhaps somehow either provoked or not prevented. What does he mean? The drama behind the war.
Before the war, whilst the West were seeing signals of Russian invasion, Russia was telling them it was just, what do you call it, military exercises. You know, Russia has this old military strategy of maskirovka, which you create deceit. But then, there was constant attempts. You see, the war, everybody knew from 1990 when Soviet Union collapsed. Although it's not a matter of if there will be war between NATO and Russia. It was a matter of when. Because the instant NATO started expanding eastward, the Russians became alarmed. And they were protesting. Perhaps they didn't take action. But then, if you keep on moving towards them and they keep telling you, then you can't tell them that they are totally wrong for taking action at the moment. The cry has been since 1990. You can't get to my door. You can't get to my door. He kept pushing. So to him, in as much as we blame, he really condemned Russia for each inhumane attack, the ferocity of the attack, the indiscriminate attack, targeting civilians. He said everything. We can't deny the fact that civilians are dying. We can't deny the fact that cities are being destroyed. We can't deny the fact that seaports are being blockaded. But the question is very simple. Can we absolve NATO and US 100%? No, they are culpable. You don't provoke a person when he fights, you tell him to take the blame entirely. So that's what he's saying. So does that make him anti-American? No. So when we try to highlight US culpability or NATO double standard, they say you are anti-American. Now, this is the purpose of asking, does that make him anti-American?
Yeah, it makes him anti-American.
It doesn't make him.
It does.
The fact makes US
and
wrong.
It makes him anti-NATO as well. Okay, that's Alhassan Bello, and I hope that you benefited from that. We will be wrapping up our program.